The topic of the talk is really a structural analysis of the ideology of the Naderid Empire, specifically how Nader used two exemplars of imperial and universal sovereignty. Imam Ali, the first of the Shi'i Imams and the fourth of the rightly guided caliphs of Islam, and of course Timur Lane, as a kind of joined exemplar and avatar of universal sovereignty that the Turco-Persianate world understood. If we're to look at these three figures, the first two, we would think these two guys go well together. The third figure is perhaps a little bit more surprising. What does the fourth caliph of Islam and the first of the 12 Shi'i Imams have to do with Nader and Timur? This is essentially to give an idea about how these three figures in the 18th century Turco-Persianate mind were actually not as separate as one might assume as a modern scholar. For this, and as an inroad to discussing why these three figures kind of elide into one avatar, we will discuss a dream narrative from a contemporary source taken from the Alam Araye Naderi, written by an Iranian officer in Nader Shah's army around the same time that he's invading India and then Central Asia. There you find the kind of narratives that are circulating around the officer corps and the kind of narratives that legitimate Nader's imperial authority in the minds of these junior and mid-ranking officers. The dream narrative is about a young Nader. This is Nader before he's a conqueror, and he's merely a margrave and a petty war chief in the northeast of the country. What is this dream narrative? The dream narrative begins with Nader encamped atop a hill, and he separates from his men, seeing a light at the foot of the hill that's leading into a mountain pass. Nader breaks away and singularly follows this light into that mountain pass. And in that dark mountain pass, he hears and then he starts to feel the mountain itself tremble. There is something that is very inauspicious at the very heart of this mountain. As he goes deeper, he discovers that there is a dragon. And in the battle that ensues between Nader and this dragon, he triumphs, of course, and the dragon reveals, as it vanishes, a well of treasure with an inscription. That inscription is left behind by Timur. In it, he says that 300 years after me, there will come the next world conqueror. That next world conqueror, I give him my mantle, and as an aid on his path and journey, adventure to world conquest, here is my personal treasure. It's very interesting to note that both Timur and Nader come from very humble backgrounds. These are not descended from royal households or imperial households. They don't even come from their own clan's nobility. Nader was the mere son of a shepherd. And in this, I think he finds in Timur a very tempting roadmap and model for how he can insert himself into imperial politics and make a stake to universal kingship. Timur was a person that was a vassal to the line of Chinggis Khan. He himself did not claim authority as an imperial ruler, given his humble background. And what you see is Nader starts out in a very similar fashion. He says that I am a mere vassal of the Safavid dynasty, the ruling household of the Iranian Empire. And it's through this vassal-master relationship that it really begins. Nader begins as a vassal that increasingly, because of his military glory and all of his conquests, circulates amongst the officer corps and builds a following based on the Turco-Mongol idea of Qut. In the Perso-Islamic texts, this is usually referred to as Dawlat. It's essentially divinely conferred glory and legitimacy. It's something that underlines that this general is attaining military success precisely because he is favored by God or the imams or some kind of divine avatar or another. It's precisely the demonstration of Qut that both Timur had been so exemplary at and Nader sees as his path to greater and greater power. Now, they're both Turco-Persianate sovereigns, Timur and Nader, and they both couch their identity and their legitimacy in the Shahnameh tradition and the Persianate epic tradition. And to go back to the dream narrative, it doesn't just give, through some very esoteric connection, Timur and his mantle of sovereignty to Nader. It also gives us an insight into the kind of tropes that a great general and a warrior is supposed to embody in the Persianate world. Defeating dragons, dragonslaying. This is one of the common kind of quests that heroes of the Shahnameh tradition and many other epics beside this take up. Here, it's a painting of Bahram-Gur, one of the Sasanian kings and heroes of the Shahnameh, that is slaying a dragon. And it's quite typical of the kind of quests that, say, Rostam, the archetypal hero of the Shahnameh, takes up as well. The dragon is usually guarding some kind of treasure. And the dragon is associated with a kind of a dark force or a lie that the truthful, heroic, divinely ordained hero overcomes. By conquering that dragon, he reveals the treasure to himself. And it's in this kind of trope, it's in this Turco-Mongol and Perso-Islamicate context that we should see the dream narrative and the kind of symbolism and meaning that it would connote in the minds of contemporaries. It's interesting to note that this isn't just a purely Perso-Islamic trope. The quest of defeating a dragon and revealing treasure, this is something that you see that Imam Ali is associated with. This is quite curious to us because for you and I, we view Imam Ali as the first of the 12 Imams and a historical figure. We distinguish him and delineate him from the mythic figures of Isfandyar, Rustam. But for the Turco-Persianate early modern generals and elites, these are inhabiting the same kind of space. These are not separate. They don't have a secular understanding of history. For them, this is just history. Imam Ali is in fact a very powerful figure in the heroic Persianate tradition in the early modern period. Imam Ali's story is re-narrativized into the context and the quests and the Persian folkloric tradition of the Shahnameh, and you see various texts such as the Khavaran-Nameh, the Ali-Nameh, very much in the style of the Shahnameh, that retell the stories of Imam Ali and invent new ones, new traditions that show Imam Ali, as you can see here painted on the left, slaying a dragon. Or on the right, slaying demons. Demons that in form and in meaning are quite obviously taken from the pre-Islamic Avestan and Persian folkloric tradition. Imam Ali and Timur are two avatars of this notion of the Sahib Qiran. Sahib Qiran in Perso-Arabic means what? The master of the conjunction of celestial spheres that signals the divinely ordained emergence of a world conqueror, of the establishment of universal authority. And this is again something that really shows us that Timur and Ali, these are inhabiting the same kind of universe of meaning in which one is not a Turco-Mongol conqueror and the other this is an Islamic figure. They have hardly anything to do with one another. They are, in fact, two avatars of a divinely ordained universal authority that Nader also wants to tap into. In fact, the Timurids engaged with Alid authority and Alid notions of legitimacy. The descendants of Timur, on his tombstone, have an inscription that describes the ancestry and the genealogy of Timur in this way. The common ancestor of Chinggis Khan and Timur was impregnated by an Alid light. So you have an immaculate conception. An immaculate conception that ties the genealogy of Timur to the genealogy of the household that he's a vassal of, binding them together, and most important of all, making them descendants of, in a very esoteric and strange way in our minds, the descendants of Ali. It really infuses Turco-Mongol genealogy, which originally has absolutely nothing to do with Islam, of course, into a very Islamicate, specifically Alid context. And this is the kind of thing that Nader himself is very much interested in, particularly given that he's the son of a shepherd. He can't make claims of being descended of a great Khan or prince or king, but he can make esoteric claims that in an unconventional way tie his essence and his ancestry to these great avatars of the Sahib Qiran, the master of the auspicious conjunction, therefore rooting his legitimacy and his identity in a very resonant notion of universal kingship in the minds of his contemporaries. There's also another kind of utility that Ali has, and what is that? Nader is conquering a massive empire that encompasses not just the traditional territories of the Safavid Empire, where the overwhelming majority of the elites are Shi'i. He's expanding it way beyond that to Hanafi Sunni lands. A great number of his officers and generals, they are Afghans, increasingly Uzbeks. When he goes to India and he comes back, many of the people he brings back with him are North Indian Hanafi Muslims. Therefore, his dispensation is no longer really reliant on Shi'i Islam. He needs an Alid discourse on universal sovereignty that articulates to his Shia audiences, I'm a servant of the 12 Imams, especially the first Imam. And to the Sunni audience, he can turn around and say, I am the most humble servant of the fourth rightly guided caliph of Islam that you and I, unlike these Shias, accept as our true exemplar and hero, a true defender of the faith. So this is what is really underlining the utility of the figure of Ali for Nader. It gives him a non-sectarian discourse on universal kingship in order to bind together a multi-confessional empire that has two major pillars, the elites of Shia Islam and the elites of Sunni Islam. And you see this in various sources. So we're going to transition now into discussing some of these sources, and we will begin by some literature. Textual source like the Fathnameh, the dispatch of conquest that he sends back after having conquered the Mughal army and marching on Delhi. He writes this and pens this to the Crown Prince of Iran. It begins, this Fathnameh, by lauding the 12 Imams and situating Iran in this kind of sacral space of Shi'i sovereignty by paying homage to Ali as the true sovereign and protector of the Iranian dominions. And then it transitions to a very Timurid kind of legitimacy because it's narrativizing how Nader carves through the Indian landscape. And one of the major obstacles that he faces is the Khyber Pass. Of course, Ali is renowned as the conqueror of Khaybar. Khaybar being a South Arabian Jewish kind of stronghold that Imam Ali is said to have conquered, but the name here is what is emotive and resonant. And the Khyber Pass in North India really gives it that Alid connection, and that's why it's emphasized in the Fath Nameh. But it's not just an Alid connection, it's also a Timurid connection, because Timur also campaigned in North India. One of his Afghan Sunni generals comes to Nader and says, "My lord, did you know that Timur, in his conquest of the Khyber Pass, he flanked the Khyber Pass using this route? I will show you the route." And therefore Nader literally follows in the footsteps of Timur, flanking the Khyber Pass and gaining victory. Guided by Ali and Timur in esoteric ways, he is figuratively, and in this case literally, following in the footsteps of the previous two Sahib Qirans, the world conquerors. And this is something that you see when he really becomes an imperial figure and when he vassalizes the Mughal emperor Muhammad Shah Rangila and also Abul Faiz Khan in Turan, the Khan of Bukhara. He has an articulation of universal kingship that is very much rooted in this Timurid Alid concept. The new coin that he mints after his conquest of India is what? Hast Sultan bar Sallatin Jahan, Shah Shahan, Nader Sahib Qiran. He is as a sultan unto the sultanates of the world. King over kings, lord of the auspicious conjunction, Sahib Qiran. Here you see him donning the aigrette. Oh, thank you very much. Here you see him donning the aigrette of imperial kingship back onto Muhammad Shah Rangila, as Muhammad Shah is very coyly bowing his head, signifying that he is the imperial overlord of Hindustan as well as being the Shah of Iran. His universal kind of authority is really taking root, and he needs to re-emphasize this kind of Timurid Alid universal dominion, particularly when he goes north and he conquers the Khans of Central Asia, of Turan. He does the same thing there. Once he comes back to his treasury in Kalat, and Kalat is this natural fortress in Khorasan in northeast Iran, where Timur is said to have had his own fortress. Nader very sharply acquires this as his own natural fortress and central treasury. And when you go there, I went there in 2019 to study the inscription. The inscription is in Imperial Qizilbash Turkic, and it is a deeply Timurid inscription. نسب إلى شرف و فخر اجاق تیمور حسب إلى بجهان شاه شاهان دور مشهور. His exalted and honorable ancestry is from the household of Timur. On this account, he is known to the world as Shah and Shah. This means that he's couching his Shahanshahik authority in expressly Timurid terms, and he's now beginning to construct a new genealogy that actually ties him to Timur. This is something that is a theme. This is not a one-off inscription. When you take a pilgrimage to Shia Iraq, a lot of Persians or Persian speakers, whether they're Afghan or maybe they are from Pakistan and they're Urdu speaking, they go to the Imam Ali shrine in Najaf and they look at the beautiful blue inscription that runs across the Ivan, and they think that we don't understand this, therefore probably it's in Arabic. Of course, the local Arabs and all of the Arab-speaking pilgrims from Kuwait or Lebanon or wherever, they look at it and they say, we don't understand this, it must be in Persian. It's in neither. It's in the Imperial Turkic Qizilbash that Nader has inscribed in 1743 in the midst of his campaign to conquer Ottoman Iraq. And in it, you find a distinctly Alid and Timurid articulation of kingship, very deeply couched in the old Turco-Persianate tradition of what it means to be a world conqueror. It's very interesting to me, and I think a point of great beauty, that at the very heart of Shi'i Islam, you find an inscription that begins by praising universal kingship in the exemplar of pre-Islamic sovereigns and mythic figures like Jamshid. He's painted here on the left. Jamshid is one of the first universal rulers in the Shahnameh tradition. It begins like this. Shah Jamshishmet dara dirayet nader deuran ke takht dawlat Jamshida varistir jahan uzra. The rarity, splendorous as Jamshid, mighty like Darius, Jamshid's true heir, world sovereign, vanquisher of the impious. And as if that doesn't tell you about the Shahanshahic scope and the universal kind of authority that is being claimed here, it's recapitulated in the subsequent line. Badakhshan la'lu umman injusin vermish kharajende, güneş tak hükmü nafiz muttasil darya ve kan üzre. Badakhshani gems and Omani pearls fill his treasury. Land and sea are united in vassalage and reverie. The idea that his authority is like the beating sun, and wherever you go, whether it's on land or sea, it's inescapable. Truly a universal sovereign. And of course, the very location of it underlines the Alid connotations of this inscription. And it's one of conquest, because the very reason why he's there in Ottoman Iraq is for conquest. Buland iqbal olan e'dalerin hem serbuland iler. Mükerrer ilemiş düşmanların başın sinan üzre. So gracious is he, honoring even his foes by raising them up high. Come see their lofty heads severed upon his lance reaching into the sky. This is probably the most outrageous line. It's basically saying you should be honored to be conquered by me. It is a privilege. This is the most Trumpian line out of all Persian poetry that I've ever come across. The blessing of this threshold is coveted by sultans far and wide. They all humbly prostrate themselves in front of this sanctum, side by side. Temennay salatindir yüzün sürtmek bu dergaha. Zahir raf'at ki ister sadr düşsün astan üzre. This is slightly ambiguous, and purposefully so. If you read the inscription from beginning to end, it's not very clear when he stops praising Nader and where he starts praising Ali. And that ambiguity is deliberate, because Ali and Nader, as well as Timur, these are essentially the same avatar, Nader would have us believe, of that divine Sahib Qirani figure, the world conqueror ordained by the Almighty. And I think it's in this regard that we should look at imperial discourse in the Turco-Persianate world. We are sometimes tempted, I think quite naturally, because we inhabit the 21st century secular and modernist mindset, to separate the figure of, say, Jamshid into, well, this is pre-Islamic folklore and myth, and Ali, for example, belongs to Islamic studies and Islamic history. When Timur, he's a steppe warrior, and that's something for people who study Turco-Mongol kind of history and Chinggisid authority. This is not how contemporaries understood them. These are integrated and inextricably linked figures that are actually avatars of the same persona. And it's by tapping into this kind of mentality and this kind of discourse, this ideological framework, that Nader claimed authority and implemented his authority onto his contemporaries. I think I will end it there, and I will open it up to questions.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. This is something that I have really thought about in retrospect after finishing the book, because it stems from not the discussion so much that I've been having here. This is just one single aspect of the book. The real kind of chapter that got me thinking about sovereignty and where it lies and whether it's derivative and in what ways in this context is actually the coronation of Nader and how he legitimates power, because there you find a divinely ordained kind of discourse on legitimacy. But that is actually taking a backseat to a new discourse on sovereignty that is unprecedented in Islamic history, as far as I know. Nader is the first person to be elected to kingship ideologically by the Ahl Iran, the people of Iran. We have the Muchalgah or Ahdnameh, the kind of treaty of coronation, and that coronation is signed, that coronation document is signed by all the grandees and attendees that gathered at the Qurultai of Moghon, the Grand Assembly of Moghon in 1736. The language, the political language, and the kind of theory of politics there is something that has not been looked at all. The historiography is that Nader is the great man. We have the great man theory of history. And one of the things that my book tries to do is offer a structural analysis of the Naderid Empire and kind of break away from the great man theory and show that how Nader is operating within the kind of discourses that have emerged. And one of the things that have emerged is a very distinct sense of Iranian collective identity and Iran as a socio-political identity, with the Iranian people given some kind of political loyalty. They are now the object of political loyalty. And then they themselves, theoretically, are somewhat sovereign, it seems, because the political language of how he comes to power and sultanship is Ma Ahl Iran an A'la Hazrat ra ikhtiyar namudim be saltanat. We, the people of Iran, elected him, sovereignly chose him, ikhtiyar. If you have ikhtiyar, it means you are mukhtar, you are sovereign. You are the sovereign decision-making power. We have elected him, chosen him, sovereignly selected him to be the Sultan. This is completely unprecedented. But it's something that is repeated after Nader is gone. Because actually the people who overthrow Nader, they hold another conclave and grand assembly in which, what does it say? We, the people of Iran, were suffering under Nader. He turned out to be a traitor. He turned out to be Sunni. It's very sectarian, the language of the treaty. And also, we now elect this person in the interests of the state. So sovereignty is something that does not have a very simple kind of answer here. It's being contested, and there are different ideas of sovereignty. Popular sovereignty is something that ideologically emerges in this period. This is, I have to emphasize, obviously not anything that you and I would understand as sovereignty. In the same way that if we went to the Roman Republic, that is not a really kind of like a system that is based on popular sovereignty. There are fundamentally different notions of popular sovereignty. And the 18th century Iran, the political language is what I'm interested in, has a fundamentally new and unexplored notion of political theory and what sovereignty is. Because at the same time, actually, in the 1720s, before Nader becomes even a thing, he's just a petty margrave, there is the first call for a constitutional monarchy when a Sufi sheikh says, we the ulama have to get together and elect a king and then draft a constitution, make him sign it and hold him to that constitution. Things that have never been really thought about before, constitutional monarchy as an idea that has never really been explored before. As far as I understand in Islamic history, the 18th century in Iran and Central Asia is a period of fundamental seismic shift. And really that's a reflection of the global kind of shift in the 18th century, no? At the beginning of the 18th century, who are the big boys? Mughal India, Qing China, Nader's empire is massive, the Ottomans are massive, and then by the end of the 18th century, who are the big boys? It's colonial European empires and no one else. The world has fundamentally shifted. So in economic structures, intellectual structures, political structures, there are so many changes. And I think we've been very Eurocentric in understanding these are where the changes are happening. And then they spread to the rest of the world. Whereas I think the changes are global. And yes, European kind of power stretches across the world by the end of the 18th century. But that doesn't mean that these other political cultures aren't fundamentally undergoing their own changes in mental structures, in physical and institutional structures. So that's a very long-winded answer to your question.
It's fascinating.
Sure. I think I'll start with the the last one first. So Iran and Fars. Fars is merely a province in the minds of the Turco-Persianate. It's in the 20th century that you have this kind of Persianization of Iranian identity. Recall, both those imperial inscriptions, were they in Persian? No, they're in Qizilbash Turkic. Iranian identity in the pre-national kind of phase, and this is an identity that is primarily in the minds and social kind of structures that the elite are envisioning, because we don't have any kind of evidence coming from 80% of the population, the kind of like peasants and mid-ranking clansmen. It's an elite identity that binds together a great many lineages and languages, very much unlike Persian Iranian nationalism of the 20th century. And the most important thing is that it is not secular and European kind of in its mental structures. Iranian nationalism is very much founded on Oriental scholarship about Iran. And why is the name Persia so prominent in modern Iranian nationalism? Precisely because they get it from the Orientalist tradition, where the West and European kind of thinking on Iran is dominated by the old Greco-Roman texts of Persia. Everything to the east of Antioch is essentially this Persia that is kind of like the counterpoint to first the Greeks and then the Romans, where these are anachronistically kind of like taken as the forebears of Western civilization. For Nader Shah, Iran is a Turco-Persianate, also an Arabic-speaking, also an Achami-speaking. The people who signed that kind of like Ahdnameh of Mughal in 1736 when he comes to power, these people come from all sorts of lineages, from Kurdish to Achami, and it's an imperial identity that doesn't have a center in terms of lineage or language. It does have a center in terms of confessional identity, however. It is a deeply sectarian identity, such that the creed of the Iranians is supposed to be Shiism, such that if you are a non-Shia, it kind of disqualifies you from being an Iranian. It is the most important and defining characteristic of this idea of Iran. And the reason why he manages to come to power is that he actually leverages, when he's a Safavid vassal, this discourse on Iranian identity and says, who is going to expunge this sacred soil, Shia Iran, from the Afghan Sunni profane other, from the Ottoman Sunni profane other? I am that hero. I am that savior. And he leverages that very well. And that sticks with his contemporaries just as much as he wants to kind of decouple from that once he becomes a universal sovereign, because he wants a non-sectarian discourse. That's why he's leaning into Ali. And he's saying, yes, Iranians are Shia, but we can live in this kind of global universal empire that I'm establishing across all Islamic realms, because I am an Alid, read to his Shia audience, first Imam, and fourth rightly guided caliph kind of avatar for world conquest. But Iran is very well defined in his idea, in that it's the old Persianate notion of the imperial realm stretching from the Euphrates to the Oxus. And in India, he says Indus. The Indus River is the kind of defining point between Iran and Hindustan. So he's expanding these borders, and he's setting out these kind of limits that are rooted in kind of a reading of the old Persianate ideas of where Iran Zamin lies in the Shahnameh and texts really before that. But I should point out that unlike the nationalist notion that there are fixed boundaries to this political entity, Iran or Iran Zamin, there are different kind of interpretations and different narratives on where the western boundary actually is. Is it the Euphrates or is it the Tigris River, maybe? Is it the Indus or is it everything that is on this side of Kabul onwards? Because in the Shahnameh, actually, it's not the Indus, and Kabul is considered part of this greater Hindustan. So it's one articulation of Iranian territoriality that is very much fixed in his mind and his imperial project. And he wants to rule kingdoms and dominions beyond these frontiers of Iran Zamin indirectly. That's why he retains Muhammad Shah Rangila. And one of the things that my book shows is that rather than just a raid and then goodbye, it is a persistent presence and relationship that is followed through for many, many years. We have records now of various tributes paid by Bengal, Awad, and even Hyderabad to the Naderid Central Treasury in the 1740s, many years after he's left, and he's now campaigning in Dagestan in the South Caucasus, in the North Caucasus. The other question was about Margraves. What is he as a Margrave? He begins as a kind of frontiersman and a Margrave on the northeastern frontier against the Uzbeks and the steppe Turkmen. I think that's maybe part of what informs his notion of territoriality and the frontiers of Iran Zamin. I don't recall the other kind of questions. The Mazar Sharif, there is no engagement with that whatsoever. For Nader, even though that's within his territories, he goes with the more conventional and probably the more historically accurate. This is Najaf. This is the true shrine of Imam Ali, and there is no engagement whatsoever with Mazar Sharif in what is now northern Afghanistan. The two major shrines that he has inscriptions at, and he really puts as the pillars of his legitimacy, are the one of Imam Reza, the 8th Imam, in Mashhad, northeast Iran, and the one just on the Euphrates, actually, of Najaf, Imam Ali in southern Iraq. So he's kind of like pointing to also the two kind of anchors that hold down the frontiers of his Iran Zamin. So how Nader Shah engages with the Shi'i ulama is not really theologically rigorous. He's not interested in rigorous theological debates. He has arrived at his conclusion that actually Shia Islam, this is when he's Shah, this is when he's no longer engaging in a sectarian, but actually a non-sectarian, universal kind of authority for his kingship. He's saying that the Shia are just the fifth school of Sunni jurisprudence. Kind of like the Hanbali Hanafi, it's just the fifth school of Sunni jurisprudence. And we are all part of this Islamic whole, and I am going to restore Islamic unity in the same way that my universal authority is spreading all across these Islamic kingdoms and empires. The relationship that he has with the ulama is problematic because the ulama are saying, where is he getting this? Like, who said that we're the fifth school of Sunni madhab? And the Sunnis are saying, I've never heard this one before. And this doesn't ultimately go his way because he doesn't have a good socio-economic relationship with the ulama. The ulama in Iran are a very rich custodial class that have tons of waqf and pious endowments. Now Nader, in order to feed that big military engine, needs a lot of money, and he starts to wholesale expropriate all of those very lucrative endowments and pious kind of foundations. And he builds up a massive amount of treasury funds from doing so. And yet he makes tons of enemies among the ulama. So the ulama are unconvinced intellectually by his arguments. And he doesn't have much of an argument. He's just like, just say we're the fifth school of Sunni madhab. I don't want to get into hadith with you. I don't know anything about hadith. That's not my thing. But do it. And at the same time, he's taking away all of their endowments. And the ulama really do not like Nader. They really see him as a tyrannical and frankly kind of blasphemous figure that is going to destroy Shiism. This is not how other social groups, especially the emirs, generals, and merchants and general populace, necessarily see Nader. Nader's discourse is a dual one, and he's speaking to two audiences, the Shia and the Sunni Hanafis, at the same time, but he's doing it in a very subtle way, such that when he speaks generally, all of them can think, oh, he's on our side. He's one of us. Why? Because when he's with the Shia, he's saying, and this is something that really comes out in the Council of Najaf that he holds when he's conquering Ottoman Iraq. He says that, look, we Iranian Shia, we've conquered all of these Sunni lands. Why? Because we stuck together and we didn't emphasize the sectarian elements of Shiism all that much. We didn't do sabul rafs, which I have banned, which is cursing the first three caliphs. Don't do that. Because look, we're in the ascendant, we're dominating them. Why would you jeopardize it by doing this and provoking anger and provoking backlash? Let's keep our Shi'i Iranian power over these Sunnis, and let's keep our mouths shut about the first three caliphs. You and I know that they're completely and utterly illegitimate. For you and I, it's Ali. Haven't you seen me speak about Ali? The first of the 12 Imams? And then he goes to the Sunnis and says, I'm converting all of them to Sunnism, but you need to give me time. So when you see them sometimes doing sabul rafs, that is actually to jeopardize our project as Sunnis. Do you understand that? They're trying to provoke you in order to destabilize the empire and to go back to the Safavids, where the Safavids are ruling in Iran, and we don't have this universal Sunni empire that you and I need to save Islam. These Rafida are smarter than you think. I know them. I was one of them. Alhamdulillah, I am now part of Ahl Sunnah and Jama'ah, and I can only protect the faith just as the fourth rightly guided caliph did, just like the three dear caliphs before him. Alhamdulillah. Don't let them provoke you. So he's stepping back, and then when he's talking to both of them, he's saying, Ali, Ali, Ali. And everyone's like, oh, we know what he's talking about. He's with us. He's not with the other guys. So he's kind of like balancing the boat between two constituents that really don't get along, that don't like each other, and he's having kind of like an imperial discourse that tries to balance between them by making each one think that he's truly one of their own. This is a very destabilizing and very risky kind of strategy, and ultimately it crumbles. It crumbles, and the kind of rhetoric of the Iranian elites when they rebel against him and eventually overthrow him is that we told you he's a turncoat. We told you that he's secretly Sunni. And what was he doing? He was using his Afghan and Uzbek and Indian and all manner of Sunni foreigners to come in, bring them to Iran, give them these high ranks and these high estates, these confiscated from us, to completely wipe the Shia of Ali out. And that's why we rebelled against him. Of course, that's not actually why they rebel against him. They rebel against him because he's taken away all of their estates and expropriated all of their endowments. And they see an opening in this 18th century kind of shift of, well, I'm a very tall, handsome, dark general. Just like Nader, why shouldn't I become the next king? There's a destabilization of who can be king. Because if the son of a shepherd can become king, every Tom, Dick, and Harry, or Hassan, Qoli, and Naghi can think that I can also become king. I also have battlefield victories. I can be the next Nader. Let's go and kill Nader. And yeah, he's Sunni, he's Afghan, whatever. So they're using this kind of ideology and this rhetoric in order to pursue material interests. And that's always the case. Everywhere in history, we leverage mental structures, just like we leverage tactics and institutions to pursue our material interests. Nader did that, the enemies of Nader did that, but eventually in the late 1740s, the enemies of Nader did it slightly better than he did finally.
I found the translation very interesting because it follows a particular rhyme scheme. So if the translation is yours, does the original verse also have the similar rhyme scheme?
The translations are mine. I tried to, and I sincerely apologize, I don't think it can even hold a candle to the eloquence and the melody of the Qizilbash Turkish, of the original inscriptions. But I tried to capture a little bit of the musicality and the power and resonance of the verses by giving you a kind of a tidied up translation, at least. In most of the inscriptions, it follows like a qasideh, kind of like the Perso-Arabic kind of form of qasideh or ghazal, and it really depends on the kind of the inscription that it follows, but most of them are qasidehs. I think, if I'm not mistaken, this is a qasideh, where the first and then the second stanzas of every bait or line rhyme, but the first and second stanzas don't. And they are some of the best Turkic poetry that I've come across from the early modern period. It's very bombastic, of course, but I don't know. I kind of like the poems just from a literary perspective. They're very interesting from a historical perspective, but just from a literary perspective, I think that very few people know about them. They're kind of like a hidden gem, especially when you see all of these kind of pilgrims going into the shrine and they just take a single look at it and then they go in and they have no idea of the kind of history and the just bizarreness. I think this is what I love about history, and this is why I got into it. It's so much more bizarre and absurd than what you would think. The fact that the inscription at the Imam Ali shrine begins by praising Jamshid, the pre-Islamic Avestan, and I think in the Sanskrit kind of tradition, he's Yima, this kind of universal sovereign that comes from a completely pagan, non-Abrahamic tradition. And he's combined and infused into a very Alid articulation of universal kingship. And by the way, Shahanshah kingship, this would be utterly bizarre to Ali and the early Muslims. I think there's a hadith by the Prophet Muhammad that I think is quite probably true, saying that in the afterlife, the most humble and wretched among you will be that who has taken the title Shah of Shahs, Malik al-Muluk, king over kings. And here you have people, I am bringing true Mohammedan Islam, I am the Shahanshah. It's the bizarreness of it and the contradiction of it is something I love. And the Ottoman sultans who claim to be the Khosrow of the age and the Kaysar-e-Rum, two positions that absolutely detested each other in antiquity. It would be someone like in 200, 300 years, like saying that they are the Ayatollah of the age and the Trump of the Dowran. It's like the contradiction, absurdity of history is something that I love, and that's why I left mathematics and the private sector to pursue this.
I was very interested in your use of dream narrative as a source. What are the particular ways in which you would use the dream narrative of the time? Who would interpret the dreams? Is dream time regarded as something distinct?
There are some accounts that say there are people who were kind of like astrologers or people who were hakim, like wise philosophers who would sometimes come to court and interpret dreams. But I think most of them are just the source giving us the dream, and encoded in it is very obvious symbolism and meaning for all people that they would understand. For example, for the Safavids, the founder of the order, not the dynasty, the founder of the order, Sheikh Safiuddin, is said to have had a kind of light, a luminescent light rising up from his chest when he's asleep. And in his dream, he says that this light then shone upon the entirety of the world, meaning that his progeny will come forth for world conquest. And this is in parallel to the Ottomans, where Osman is said to have had a shajareh, a tree sprouting from his chest and covering the entire globe, meaning his progeny, his shajareh, his dynasty, will one day come to rule the earth. So dream narratives in the Turco-Persianate tradition, they had a very deeply ingrained, and to these people, very obvious symbolism about universal authority and sacredly ordained, divinely ordained, where the dream is where the prophets or the imams come and communicate a mission or a truth onto the believer, onto that saintly figure, whether it's Sheikh Safiuddin of Ardabil, the founder of the Safavid dynasty, or Osman, the kind of like the Bey who gave rise to the Ottoman dynasty.
So, Vijit, and then.
So my specific question is, you have emphasized about the connection between Nader Shah and Timur and Imam Ali. So I have understood the connection between Nader Shah and Timur, where they're similar, humble backgrounds. But my specific question is, in the connection between Nader Shah and Imam Ali, other than the title of a conqueror, which both Nader Shah and Imam Ali are, according to the inscriptions, what are the other aspects that connect both of them together?
So it's not Imam Ali that you and I are familiar with. I mean, sometimes when I talk about this with my fellow Iranians back home, especially if they come from, say, a religious background and they're part of the ulama, they say that, astaghfirullah, what is Imam Ali doing, fighting dragons, like slaying demons? What kind of Imam Ali is this? Where in Sahih al-Bukhari or whatever kind of text that we never saw that hadith. This is not the Imam Ali that you and I are familiar with, that is very much rooted in the tradition that the ulama give us. This is an Imam Ali as envisioned and imagined and understood by the Turco-Persianate elites. Those emirs, those officers, those chancellery scribes and viziers who are raised on texts like the Khavaran-Nameh, the Ali-Nameh, where Ali is a kind of a Persianate, heroic folk hero who goes out and in various kind of quests faces a dragon that is guarding a treasure or slays a sorceress. Things that are not really in any of the kind of what you and I would think as the orthodox texts of Islam, but to the Turco-Persianate elites of early modernity. For them, the connection between Nader as a world conqueror, a Persianate hero, and Ali as this Persianate world conqueror and hero would be kind of almost obvious. It would be a no-brainer. So this is something that is not necessarily new to Nader. Timur himself, like I said, he tried to establish this connection. He even made his descendants even made the outrageous claim that the common maternal ancestor of Timur and Chinggis Khan was impregnated by Alid light, kind of like an immaculate conception by this Persianate hero that is roaming around the earth in the guise of light, impregnating Mongol women in order to give birth to the new avatars of him, the world conqueror. These are the kinds of things that a modern kind of seminary student sitting in Qom would say, I had no idea that people were so misguided, and I reject this. And you and I actually are closer to that seminary student sitting in Qom than we are to the average Turco-Persianate kind of vizier or emir sitting in some kind of chancellery chamber or in the Urdu in the camp with Nader Shah. Because the world that they inhabit, and this is again what I love about history, the world that you think you don't know at all. It's such an odd, bizarre, foreign landscape, mentally more than anything else.
Okay, last question, I think.
Thank you for your talk. This is very enlightening. I was just wondering, out of general curiosity, what were the Ottoman interactions with Nader Shah like? Because you're also inhabiting the same spaces, as well as, say, inheriting a tradition from Timur as well.
Timur is the archetypal model of universal kingship for the Mughals, even the Turanians who oust the Timurids, the Iranians, as well as the Ottomans. Such a successful kind of world conqueror kind of becomes the exemplary model for all of these kind of successor states. With regards to how the Ottomans engaged with Nader, the Ottomans were, from the very beginning, very antagonistic to Nader. I will share with you, even in terms of political thought, how they clashed. Because the Ottomans had the old notion of state and dynasty, Dawlat and Dudman, as being inextricably linked. And in the negotiations, we have like the kind of text of some of the, and record of some of the negotiations between the Iranian and Ottoman diplomats. When I say Ottoman, they themselves refer to themselves as diplomats of Rum and the Dawlat Rum, the state of Rome. They say that the Dawlat Rum is like a chaste and sacred mother that is never abandoning the Ottoman dynasty. They are one, and they will always and forever be bound in one union. Whereas the state of Iran is a wretched woman of ill repute, who is now under Nader. Before that was under the Hotakid Afghans who had conquered it from the Safavids, and before that was under the Safavids. Why should we even negotiate with you, Nader of Iran, when the Iranian state is this profligate woman of ill repute, who is every now and then going under a new dynastic order? So for them, the unbinding of the Iranian state from a specific dynasty is outrageous. And Nader, when he's a Safavid vassal, he's saying that I am actually abrogating the peace that my overlord, Tahmasp II of the Safavid dynasty, made with the Ottomans, because it is the maslahat dawlat Iran, the interest of the Iranian state, for me to resume the war and take the war to the Ottomans to recapture Iranian territory. This is, again, unprecedented. The interests of the Iranian state, what on earth does that mean? And Tahmasp has to say that when he's deposed, he has to say that everyone is accusing me of being a traitor. That is inconceivable to think or say prior to that, prior to the 18th century. What does it mean for a sovereign to be a traitor? To who? To what? You are loyal in a political system to the ultimate authority, the dynastic ruler, the king. And in the early modern period, both actually, if you've been paying attention to what Europeans have been saying, in Europe as well as in Iran, and I think other political cultures, there is a decoupling. Political loyalty is given to an abstraction of the state that is rooted in the idea of a realm and a certain collective, rather than the idea of a dynasty and a certain king. This is something that really worries the Ottomans at a fundamental level. And of course, Nader is saying you have to recognize the Jafari school as the fifth school of Sunni Islam, otherwise I'm going to invade you. And the Ottomans are like, we want peace with you, but this fifth school is an outrageous innovation. All of our ulama reject it harshly, and I'm sorry, but my hands are tied. I would like to, but I can't. So they're kind of caught between their own legitimacy as the caliphs of true Sunni Islam and this newcomer, this very dangerous newcomer that is essentially thrusting war onto them and saying, for the sake of Islam and the unity of the Islamic faith, I'm going to have to invade the Ottoman realms in order to compel the Ottoman caliph to accept the fifth school of Sunni jurisprudence. So he's kind of like putting the blame on the Ottomans for starting the war. And the Ottomans find this extremely annoying. In general, I think the people who lived outside of Iran's borders and eventually people who lived inside Iran's borders found Nader to be a kind of an insufferable person. You can kind of tell from that line, it is an honor to be kind of like killed at my hand. You should be so lucky for your head to be ending up on my lance. But I think we'll end it there. And thank you again for inviting me over to SNU.
And thank you so much for coming here and giving us this wonderful,
My pleasure.
wonderful talk.
My
And
pleasure.
thank you all